Everyone, Mr. G here. Today, I'm going to talk to you guys about changes to society in post-war United States. So for today, you're going to need the Changes in Post-War Graphic Organizer on Google Classroom. So first off, why this matters. In the post-war, actually in the same year that the war ends, we're going to see the Spanish flu, which is actually going to infect a third of the world's population, and we'll see some images of that later. It's very interesting given what's going on today. You're going to see some changing roles of women and minorities, African Americans and Mexican Americans in particular. And the US is going to become an economic powerhouse after World War One, which I'll go into more detail of. Lastly, we're going to see the Great Migration, which is one of the most important events in African American history in the United States. Very important. And our essential question for today is what political, social, and economic effects did World War One have on the US? Okay, so women's role in the United States changed during the war and after the war in that women filled jobs that were left vacant by men. We see this a lot of times whenever a large portion of the male population goes to war, women will fill the jobs necessary. So, munitions, meaning making ammunition for guns, railroads, trolleys, they're going to work on those. Some of them are going to be farmers, become telegraph operators. And women, rightfully so, get the idea that, wait a minute, we can do the same work as men. How come we're not being able to, how come we're not represented the same way? How come we still can't vote? And they bring this up to President Wilson. We talked about women's rights and suffrage before, in that women were the first people to protest outside of the White House. And eventually, President Wilson will say that giving women the right to vote is vital to winning the war because they are participating in society in other ways. So the 19th Amendment is going to pass in 1919, and women are going to gain the right to vote. And this is a picture of some women actually voting for the very first time in the 1920 election. Okay, so next I'm going to talk about the Great Migration, which is a massive movement of African Americans from the places that you see down here in green to the red destination cities. So I'll talk more about this in a second, but this is your visual. So just keep in mind where you see the green in the south and where you see these lines of these are migration corridors. So these are where people are going and how they're getting there. So we're seeing people go all over the East Coast to the Great Lakes region, Midwest right here, and California out here. So there are some push and pull factors for immigration or for migration, similar to what we talked about during the massive migration from Europe to the United States prior to World War One. So some push factors. A clear one would be Jim Crow segregation. So African Americans are still being treated terribly and are being violently attacked across the South due to the color of their skin and the fact that they're kept in different communities and separate from white people. They have terrible low-paying jobs. They're not given the same economic or housing opportunities that white people are given, which has an incredibly bad effect on African American families and wealth. And also the cotton, which still many African Americans relied to work on due to Jim Crow segregation and the general oppression of African Americans after the Civil War. So cotton is still going to be very important, and it's going to be destroyed by pests during this time period, which means the only economic base that a lot of African Americans were working with is completely gone. Not to mention their jobs already pay next to nothing. So pull factors are economic prosperity in the North, like especially in the Great Lakes region where we see a lot of American manufacturing take off later. Job openings due to reduced immigration. So there's actually a reduction in immigration due to the First World War and things like that. So it opens up opportunities for African Americans. And there's also African Americans that are already in the North that are willing to help other African Americans move from the South. So that's a huge pull factor. Okay, so Mexican Americans are going to move north as well, just not as far north as New England and places like that. So Mexicans are going to flee across their border to escape violence and poverty. If you remember to the past lectures about the Mexican government and how it was being overthrown constantly, and we overthrew the Mexican government indirectly a couple times. So Mexico is a very unstable, violent place as a result of that political violence and instability. And a lot of Mexican Americans or Mexicans are going to move to the American West and California. And many of them are actually going to seasonally migrate, meaning they will come from Mexico to California in the American West. They will work on farms, on crops, and they'll move back when that crop is out of season. One really interesting thing that I found when researching this was the barrios. I'm probably not saying that correctly. I'm sorry. Barrios. And this is essentially another name for a Hispanic neighborhood that pop up in Los Angeles and cities like that. So you have these. This is an example of one of the first Hispanic neighborhoods that they are very much intertwined. So it's a very strong community. They look out for each other, in part because they are facing discrimination. And I thought it is a very interesting way for communities to organize themselves. We talked about uh, the mutualistas before, where we have minorities that are forming basically their own banks and systems to help themselves. I believe that was the Hispanic community. And then we also have the Spanish flu. Now, right now we have COVID-19, but about 100 years ago we had the Spanish flu, which is a form of influenza flu. Um, and this outbreak killed 50 million people worldwide, which is more, almost as many as some estimates put it in World War II. We're talking about 10 million less people than World War II by some estimates. This is more, way more than the amount of people that died in World War One. And about a third of the world is going to get infected. So every third person in the world will get the Spanish flu. And it's made much worse by the war because you have all of these soldiers coming back from Europe and other places where they've been in filthy trenches, disease-ridden trenches with terrible medical equipment for so long. They come back, it's much easier for them to get sick. And then one other note, um, even though it's called the Spanish flu, it's called that because the first couple cases that were reported were in Spain, or not reported, but publicized. But it's not necessarily where the flu started. We're not entirely sure, although some scientists and historians actually believe it might have started on a U.S. From a U.S. military personnel. So if you look at this picture, it might look familiar to what you might be seeing on the news. We've got the U.S. police force all wearing face masks, and we've got an entire family over here all wearing face masks, except the cat. But so what's interesting about this is we're seeing the same thing that we're seeing now with face masks, and this eventually came to an end. The Spanish flu, same thing as COVID. So I just wanted to share these pictures with you because I found them a little partially surreal and also very interesting. So the next major American uh, debacle, you could call it, is the Red Scare. So, like we talked about before, this is going to be the period of the Soviet Union emerging onto the world stage. Um, the Soviet Union coming out of the overthrow of the former Russian government by Vladimir Lenin. And what you're going to see is the Soviet Union encouraging other countries to engage in the same type of revolution. They're telling their people to overthrow capitalist governments for uh, a communist government instead. And a couple countries in Central and Eastern Europe will follow suit. In the United States, this spreads a huge wave of fear about communists and radicals. So this is known as the Red Scare. This is in part made worse by the fact that some anarchists who believe in no centralized government or no control of government will set off bombs across the United States, including they will bomb Wall Street and kill about 20 people. Uh, the U.S. will respond to this Red Scare, the government, with a series of raids called the Palmer raids, which were basically just mass arrests and deportations of primarily Europeans, Central and Eastern Europeans, without trial or charge. So you might not be charged with anything, you might not even get a trial, but you can get deported. And then this is an example, a great example of an anti-communist, this is Red Scare propaganda, saying this is tomorrow. You've got a burning American flag. Um, you've got some tough guys that are supposed to be, I guess, Soviets manhandling and beating up people and just generally causing anarchy. And the caption says, America under communism. Lastly, I want to talk about America's new normal. So after the World War One ended, Americans wanted to go back to normal. They're like, this has been crazy. We want to feel safe again. So in the election of 1920, this is the big ticket item. Are we going to go back to normal, or are we going to become basically a new player on the international stage in a more direct way? So Warren G. Harding, the Republican, faced off against Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat. Woodrow Wilson wanted a more internationalist approach. He wanted to work with the League of Nations and other and other countries in order to prevent further conflicts. Warren G. Harding's view is that we need to basically return to the way things were before World War One. We should not become as involved as Woodrow Wilson wants us to be. And in that election, Warren G. Harding is going to win with a landslide victory. So, I talked about this before and why this matters. The US after World War One is going to become an economic giant. Not as big as it will be after World War Two, because, spoiler alert, we got the Great Depression coming. But right now, the US is the richest industrialized country that hasn't been bombed to pieces, essentially, other than the United Kingdom. So it is the leader in industrial output, and the US is going to become the big creditor, meaning people are going to owe, mainly Europe, us a lot of money. So all of Europe almost will owe the US money, and this is going to be a adrenaline boost to the US stock market. And then this is a picture of Warren G. Harding. He seems like a very nice guy. Um, and he will be the president for the next couple of years. So this is all I have for you guys today. I hope that you guys stay safe and healthy and have a great rest of your day.